Hello, and welcome to another Tattered Cover Live event. You can access closed captioning down on the bottom right of your screen. And then I'm gonna turn it over to Jayla Poppleton. Please welcome Jayla Poppleton.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here this evening for this special event. My name is Jayla Poppleton. I'm the Executive Director for Water Education Colorado, and we're one of your hosts in partnership with the Tattered Cover. We're really pleased to be partnering with them on this series for the Water22 Book Club. And I'm going to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about our organization and the Water22 campaign, and then I will bring up our featured speakers for the evening. So Water Education Colorado is a statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring that Coloradans are informed on critical water issues and equipped to make decisions that guide our state to a sustainable water future. We have been working in Colorado for 20 years, and we work across the state. We provide a wide variety of programs for different audiences, ranging from publications to webinars to leadership training, courses on water, and also a news service called Freshwater News. And this year, we're pleased to be spearheading a public awareness campaign called Water22 for the year 2022 that was launched in partnership with the governor, who declared it the Year of Water, to recognize the importance and value of water in our everyday lives as Coloradans, and also to highlight risks to its sustainability in the face of population growth pressures and climate change, and the effects that we're seeing with drought. And so the campaign Water22 has a wide variety of activities that we're using to draw attention to water issues and also to encourage Coloradans to get involved. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the event, just things that you can do to be part of the solution, ways that you can get involved. You can go to water22.org to learn more. But this event is part of the Water22 Book Club, which is a way that we're spurring more awareness, involvement, and discussion around water issues. And we've been featuring different titles that have different themes related to our water, and I'm really excited for tonight's discussion. And so without further delay, I would like to bring up our moderator for tonight and introduce Dr. James Pritchett, who is the Dean of the College of Agricultural Sciences and the Director of the Agriculture Experiment Station at Colorado State University. He's originally from Southeastern Colorado. He's a two-time alumnus of CSU and has received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in agriculture and applied economics. He's trained as a land-grant university economist who enjoys working in a wide range of teaching, research, and engagement activities, including water resource economics, community development, agribusiness management, and interdisciplinary approaches to land management. We think he's just a fantastic person to enter into this conversation with tonight's featured author, who I'm going to let him introduce. So thank you. I hope that you enjoy the discussion. We do want to allow some time for questions from the audience toward the end. So please enter those questions into the chat as they come up for you. And Dr. Pritchett will be moderating those questions and fielding them for our featured author. Thank you, Dr. Pritchett. And now I turn it over to you.
Jayla, thank you very much. And my hat's off to Water Education Colorado for the great work that you do on behalf of the state of Colorado around water resources, and especially Water22. I can't imagine a better way to celebrate a year of understanding and maybe activism too, when it comes to our water resources in Colorado. So thanks to that. And tip of the cap to the Tattered Cover too, which is long for my family and for Coloradoans, been just a great supporter of the arts and of good thinking and good discussions, which is what we're going to have tonight with Tershia Delgin. I want to let you know I've had a chance to get to know Tershia face to face, but became acquainted with her writing long before then about what has happened in Colorado and how she relates to that personally. Tershia Delgin is an author, an illustrator, a journalist, an activist, and a self-described adverb vigilante. We may have to ask her a little bit about that later. She's based in San Diego and is a water resources consultant, and she also oversees a working farm on the South Platte River in Colorado with her family, not too far from Milliken. Colorado on the South Platte. As you speak and you engage with Tershia, as we will tonight, you'll understand that she has an innate curiosity about her. She asks very good questions of what she observes and of the people that are around her. But she's not merely satisfied with the first crossing. Tershia probes the upper reaches of our understanding with precision and always grounds her inquiry in her lived experience. That's a very careful way to do things. And it's a gift to the narrator of creative nonfiction. And it is a book of creative nonfiction that brings us together tonight. It opens a passage for us and really perhaps will quench our thirst a bit as we think about things that happen today and what they mean to us at a personal and at a political level. The book is titled The Man Who Thought He Owned Water, and it was awarded the 2017 Colorado Book Award for creative nonfiction. In reviewing the book, I thought that Goodreads did an excellent job of being able to describe what takes place in The Man Who Thought He Owned Water. And in this review, they write, The Man Who Thought He Owned Water is author Tershia Delgen's fresh take on the gravest challenge of our time: how to support urbanization without killing ourselves in the process. The gritty story of her family's experience with water rights on its Colorado farm provides essential background about American farms, food, and water administration in the West, in the context of growing cities and of climate change. Enchanting and informative, The Man Who Thought He Owned Water is an appeal for the urban-rural cooperation over water and resiliency. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Tershia Delgen. Tershia, please join us.
Oops, one moment. Hi, thank you, all of you, so much. Everyone has a lot more poise here than I, and I'm very grateful to James for being my interlocutor, to Jayla and Hillary, and to Shea of the Tattered Cover, to all the people who helped me write the book, and particularly in this context to Patty Rettig, who operates under the humble guise of a librarian, but is doing so much for water at CSU. And also to all of you people out there, thank you. And so there's so many more people to thank, but anyway, hopefully I'll get to that. So I hope that we'll be talking about narrative and whether narrative can or can't save the world in its various forms. So off we go.
Well, I'll just remind everybody that they can drop a question in the chat if they'd like to ask a question, Tershia. I was so compelled as I read the book and connected personally with a lot of what you've written, much in the way that you had. And in the context of the book, in that personal narrative you had, you write about your father, William Eaton Phelps. There are two pretty prominent names in Colorado, in Eaton, a governor of Colorado, and Phelps, one of the I guess architects in some sense of Colorado, and how your dad kind of grew up quickly. His parents left him in Denver while his father was stationed in DC during World War II. So he kind of grew by a little bit of trial and error and doing the things that he wanted to, and then he eloped with his wife Gogo. And they ended up eventually buying this farm and ranch located on the South Platte River. And you write throughout the text about your parents, and I can really feel the connection that you have with them. I'm just curious about, if you look at them, what are the traits that you most like about your dad, Bill, and what traits do you most like about Gogo?
Well, I really loved everything about them, but I think the important thing is that I've exploited them to tell the story. And neither one of them were all one thing. And I don't think I portrayed them that way, but the thing that they had in common was commitment to each other and to their differences. And so my mother represented the urban and the city point of view, and my father, the rural. And these are differences that we have in our lives today, both in terms of what to do with water, what to do with politics, and so forth. And so I hope that narrative, that duality, comes across to the reader in a way that, well, they didn't agree, but yes, they did agree. And that I think the third character is indeed the land, and that literally grounds the story. The land is the star, the farm, this Big Bend station. And so how's that? That was my first answer to a question, audience. So I'm a writer, not a talker. Off we go.
You know, I really love the questions you asked, Tershia, and also the way you sort of reveal things to us through your narrative. And it occurs to me that when you've talked about your writing process, you've talked about it as one where you always test assumptions. And the premise of this book has a lot to do with some assumptions that people have, and also assumptions that we all have about our understanding and perhaps our knowledge. What's an assumption that you first tested when you began to write this book? And I'm curious about if you had an assumption that you'd like to take for a test drive today, what would that be?
Well, I think it's funny because one of the things I learned from my parents is I might not be right. And that idea of coming into a subject about which I knew nothing. So that for listeners who haven't read the book, half of the water rights were cut off at the family farm when the crop was in the ground. My father, it was a big panic because my father had died, and my mother was like, ah. So I got there in the middle of that to try to help her. So my first assumption was my mom has been screwed, to start with, because the idea of owning water rights and so forth, but not knowing then led out to make the story greater. And luckily our farmer, Ronnie Ackerman, without whom I could not have understood or written anything, was wonderfully helpful, and also gave the farmer's point of view. And that connected me to Jack Oder, another incredibly bright man, and to Bob Longbaugh, both water engineers and hydrologists. And I don't know anything about hydrology or engineering. I wasn't even really yet writing. But as I learned more, I thought, I need to write this down. And so it gradually became a book. And so those assumptions then ran into a whole other narrative because the water, why had the water been curtailed? And we have, I live in San Diego at the end of the Colorado River straw, and it's the same thing. Our cities, as they are in Colorado, are water hungry, and they're motivated by this thing called great and growing cities. That's got a lot of money behind it, government and the courts and the lawyers and so forth. And they have their own rationale about what's the priority and what's not. And still going with the idea that I'm not an expert, I kept writing. So I had this duality going on throughout, which was tense, but who doesn't love being tense, really? So it was interesting. And then that, I wanted to say this too. I thought that it would be easy for me to place the book because I'd been fixing manuscripts and writing books for hire for many years for Manhattan people, but I didn't have a platform. This was a new subject. And I'm so lucky, we are all lucky that the University Press of Colorado has this commitment to its state. And they operated then, I think they've got a new office now, but it was like, it was the most they're all crowded into this little room, all together like something out of Dickens, working so hard and putting up with so much for me about everything. And then that their involvement brought Justice Hobbs and Hal Simpson and people that helped me so much, helped us, they're helping us. And to another whole story from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's all I got on that one, I think. Blah, blah, blah.
Tershia, it has pressed me as I looked through the book and read the book and recognized the names and know some of the personalities that are in the book. And certainly the tension that was created with the well shutdown that took place, that was more than 2,000 wells that shut down. That really brought up a lot of passion, a lot of divergent points of view, and some hard feelings, frankly, in that time. And yet, folks were willing to speak to you and describe to you about what their point of view was, or the assumptions that you were testing, and were willing to share that with you. Is there a part of your process that allows that creates that open door where they can come in and share that space with you? Or I'm curious about the craft when it comes to that.
You mean what I don't know why people like, how did you get seduced into doing this? I don't know. I have no I have no idea. My parents were very charming, and growing up, we grew up on a guest ranch in Wyoming, and where we had to be nice to strangers. And I think maybe that helps.
Tershia, with that in mind too, is there a point of view that, going back and looking at the book, that you think is missing? That maybe you tried to bring in, or in retrospect, gosh, you wish you would have brought that forward?
That's why I really want to talk with you, James, and also with the audience, because in looking at the book again, which is, I finished with the book 8 years ago. I mean, and I've moved on to a different project that's also demanding. So, but looking at the book, I think, considering how complicated the topic it is, with replacement water and augmentation plans and all these really complex things, it's pretty good. But I don't have a feeling of having reached the urban audience that I was after. And we're speaking in the context of northeastern Colorado, where Greeley and Fort Collins, and areas that are much more attuned to agriculture than most cities, and certainly more attuned to it than Denver. And I feel I have failed, because city people, in my experience, are still blaming or criticizing if farmers use water as being a fail-safe or an answer. The farmers shouldn't be doing that, and then we'd have plenty of water for cities. And I really tried so hard to get across this idea that the farmers aren't growing anything and the farmers I know are very economical in how they use water. And there's a lot on them that forces their crop choices. And it's not just, oh yeah, I'm going to sell this to Asia. It's also, I know very little about this, so I'm not an expert on any of this, but I saw at our own farm, when our wells were cut off, we started growing alfalfa, which is in the news all the time now, as being a problem. And the wells were turned off. We had not enough water, and the farmers said, well, we'll plant non-GMO alfalfa. We've got to hold the soil down. We've got to keep the weeds out. And there's a lot to recommend alfalfa as a crop, but it also was making the best of what they had, which is true every single year for a farmer or a rancher. How am I going to, they don't make enough money to, they don't have enough money to defend their water. They don't have enough money to that or time for defense. But don't you agree, James, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right about that, Tershia, that there's complexity around the decision making. That is there's sort of the challenge of the now. If you're a farmer or if you're an urban water provider and your job is to make sure that your households never run out of water. There's sort of an urgency in the now, and then there's a broader perspective or challenge of seeing how we're using the resource over time and what sort of incentives are in place and how people respond to those incentives. And I don't know that we step back and have the conversation about the large enough to head off what are challenges coming toward us and the dynamics of climate change, as an example. And that broader conversation in a place where you can join together and have differences of opinion and agree that it's okay to have differences of opinion and have a commitment to the future. That may be part of what we need to do in order to be successful.
Do you, one of the things I was thinking about with our conversation coming up, and it's now on a page I haven't turned to, so we could get really, is the idea of, here, let me just turn so I don't bundle. Hold on. That, if I can find it, page 83 here. Hold on. Oh, balls. Anyway, it's the idea of climate negatively affecting water management as being a paradigm, or as you suggested in one of your questions, a truth. If that's a truth, climate negatively affects their what. So my idea is to climate negatively affects water management. And so what I hope I don't go down, don't let me go down the rabbit hole, James. You can always pull me back. So the opposite of that is that water management negatively affects climate. And I feel as if there were more studies or more conversations or more predictions about that could, like with ecosystem services and so forth, that it would help. And an example, well, I can use the example of at the farm that I write about of the wetlands, because I learned in the process of researching for the book that 65% of the wetlands, which are great carbon sinks, 65% of the wetlands on the Front Range had been destroyed between, well, in 12 years. It was so like 1985 to 1997 or something like that, just gone and not offset. So how did laws, how, you know, somebody hadn't noticed that mattered. And so it happened. So if there were studies that showed what wetlands have and carbon that they can sequester, so that kind of thing. And so that's one example. And so at the farm, I'm like, okay, it's easy to talk about. Let's see, Tershia, can you try it? Because it's always easy to see problems and much more difficult to do them. And so we did, I don't know, we don't still own the farm, so I don't know how what we were working with was 40 acres of wetlands.
Mhm.
And that's work that I do in California too, when I can have enough time. So, but another example that didn't involve any work, just Jerry Mallett, the executive director of Colorado Headwaters, told me last week, sent me an article about a ranch on the Arkansas that had burned 20,000 acres. And that was in April this year. And now in August, the creek bed or waterway there has been, is restoring itself with beavers, and the prairie short grasses are coming back. And so it's like carbon, carbon in the ground. And so there are things like that that are so interesting, but it's hard to get the money part of it, the studies focused on that. Do you know how to do it from your perspective there?
It's a great, Tershia, that's a great question. And what I would say is that in the history of sort of agriculture and society in general, there was a time period when we wanted to make sure that everybody had access, had enough to eat, and that we provided the amenities and the lifestyles. And as changes occurred over time, we've become had more understanding about the consequences of responding to that incentive solely. And we're beginning to understand that systems make a lot more sense to us, ecological systems, and how climate influences those systems, going from the smallest of microbial interaction to sort of meta interactions that take place across landscapes. So awareness is increasing, and if we keep asking those kinds of questions and be able to draw the connecting points to challenges that we're facing now, I think more funding flows in that direction. Colorado does a good job of asking those questions now, I think, as a state, and we're beginning to see at a federal level more of those. So I'm hopeful for sure that we'll keep asking those better questions and drive the conversation there. Tershia, I do have a question in the chat, if I might just share that with you. This is from Carrie Schneider. Water rights in the West are based in a large part on what I believe is the prior appropriations doctrine, is what Carrie's writing about, right? So the first in time is the first in right. Do you think that's still a sensible way to distribute water?
Do I think? That's even a big question right there. Carrie is a dear friend of mine and a very smart woman. And I think and this is where if only Greg Hobbs were alive, he could just chime in and explain. I don't know if I can do this. There's not enough water in the West to find an easy way to allocate water. It was advised against from the very beginning, from Powell on. This is not a good idea. There's not enough water. And so this idea of the prior appropriation, I think, is equitable as long as it's I'm not knowledgeable enough, but the problem is that it's supposed to be speculation proof in a way that limits carrying water off without having an actual beneficial use right there. And is that true? Do you think, James? Help me, because I don't know enough. But if you don't have that, what do you have? That's the problem. Like there's a thing now about the fishermen wanting to be able to fish in whatever hole because he wants access to the river. And I know at our farm, people wanted to come in and fish and hunt, and we were responsible for maintaining that land as owners and keeping it clean and keeping the weeds out and keeping all these things and maintaining the wildlife. And we have a lot of public land, but this is private land that people have bought and paid for the water rights and the mineral rights and the surface rights. What do you do to pay them back? I don't know.
James, you've asked a great question, and we won't answer Carrie's question tonight, I think. but what I would say is that there's a tension between water as a public good that we all enjoy, that we all have benefits from, and as a private good when it's put to its beneficial use. And it's not so much the prior appropriations doctrine that we seek to challenge sometimes. It's the results of having an allocation framework, a series of institutions that allocate water that may not be what we find to be beneficial for society. And it's important for us to ask those questions. You know, what are the safeguards that need to be in place? And do we feel like we're doing the right thing in terms of equity and fairness when it comes to managing our water resources? So those are difficult questions to ask for sure, and worthy of some sophisticated legal arguments, as well as some practical considerations. Makes me wish we had Justice Hobbs here too, Tershia, to talk about that. Steve Lunt has asked a question too, Tershia. Let me know how you feel about talking about special districts. So Steve asked the question, would you talk some about your understanding of special districts? Are they the evil dark side, or just smart people figuring out how to better manage water and make money at it? And can they be a good thing? Can special districts be a good thing?
Boy, I don't know. I don't know, because smart people figuring out how to make money at something can also be the dark side, right? The experience that I write about in the book of the special districts, because and remember, audience, I wrote this when I was much younger and I didn't know anything. So I was writing down what happened related to one place. So that related in some way, because it was all in the South Platte. So the special district that came upon us was one formed by a very smart, very, very smart man named Bob Lemke. And he took us by surprise because he learned that we had an old, very senior ditch right, and that he might be able to nab that, I think. And Mr. Lemke, if you're listening, and if I'm saying this wrong, I'm really sorry. But it was disturbing to us because we were using that for whatever we could grow at the time, and also for the wetlands. And it had always been there, and it was already wet. Everything was wet there in the cattails and sedge and so forth. And we had already talked to Ducks Unlimited about getting their help in increasing its habitat value, getting more vegetation in there that the birds would benefit from. And therefore, and then you have this thing with pollination and everything, like my pollinator dress. And it turned out that Ducks Unlimited was doing recharge ponds, not down where the wetlands were, but up behind us, up gradient, and wanted to take the water that was feeding the ducks near the river where it would normally happen and move it up gradient so the water could flow back down. So I don't know whether special districts are a good idea or not, but I think part of, the reason, and James, you and I talked about this before, about population, the reason this happens is because for some reason we can promoting, well, not for some reason, because the cities need to have growth in order to pay for their infrastructure, because that's the plan. And in San Diego, let's build more housing. It's empty, a lot of it, but we're using water from the Imperial Valley to keep growing. And so the Imperial Valley is planting alfalfa because it has less water. It's just, and in the meantime, our vegetables are coming from other countries, our berries are coming from other countries, and it feels really out of control to me. It feels like, what's tomorrow, Venezuela? That's a little hysteric, but maybe.
You know,
So-
Tershia, I agree with you. I'm not sure the special district concept is a bad concept, but it's interesting to understand what the intent is and what the consequences are of having that. And it could be quite a useful tool. But again, it's the details sure seem to matter, much like a water footprint does. And so I've heard you talk a little bit about water footprints of both an understanding between urban folks and rural folks about when you bring food into the city, you're importing water in. Just like when you're sending crops somewhere, you're exporting water out. And that kind of holistic idea of thinking about the importance of water and the interconnectedness and understanding the demands is really important when you start thinking about population growth and where people grow and where our food comes from. So really interesting questions in that kind of space. Do you think there's a lesson there that you would want to leave folks with to think about? Because I've heard you talk a little bit about that around the edges. But if there were a message that you want folks to really understand about that, what might you pass on?
I would pass on that from the tap, the average American uses from the tap about 100 gallons a day. So that's just average. You know, some people are using more, some people are using less. That's from the tap. That's municipal water, or, you know, water in the country is not, it's county. Okay, so, but the average American consumes 2,000 gallons of water a day in other things: food, clothing, solar panels, semiconductors. Everything requires water, everything. And so for me, that inhibits some behaviors. I don't know, I'm certainly not perfect, but knowing that, it's like everything becomes precious, and that's the truth. That's where we are now. Everything is precious. And it's maybe less precious for a lot of us than it is for people who can't afford to be on the Zoom tonight, or for some reason don't, it's there's so many people who are doing so much worse than us. So it's worse off, not doing worse, but are worse off. And our behavior affects that, because we're using more water and they have, so all this is sort of in terms of accountability. And thinking too about our narratives. So James, what do you think is missing from the water in terms of economics in the storytelling?
You know, Tershia, I didn't know you'd be asking me questions as we went along.
Oh, I'm trying
You did hint in our previous conversation you had asked. Yeah, so for the group that's with us, my training is in economics, and having grown up in Colorado, I have an affinity for rural areas. And so early in my career, I began to ask questions about rural economic development and how important irrigated agriculture was to that development. And what I found was it wasn't so interesting that I could describe the economic impact of what losing an irrigated acre would be, depending on what was grown. But it was more the personal narrative about that choice and the implications of that choice and how it affected lives and schools and jobs and what that meant. So I think that a piece around the storytelling about the narrative that can come to us from numbers is understanding the interconnectedness in different kinds of ways. What do we have access to? What does it mean for a local school district if you no longer have the jobs that support your neighborhood schools? What are the implications of making those kinds of choices? So I think that's one of the narratives that is often lost in this conversation, are the broader impacts. I think too, one of the numbers that stands out for me, Tershia, when it comes to agriculture and water, is the advancing age of the typical farmer in Colorado. You know, and that age can be 60, 61, 62 years old, and there's a big intergenerational transfer that's about to happen. But for young people to become involved in agriculture, they do need assets like water, and they do need to find a pathway to be able to do that. And I don't know that we've thought a lot about intergenerational equity when we think about those numbers and the kinds of things that happen. So those are the stories I like to tell with numbers and thinking about those questions.
Well, but that's also very scary though, isn't it? Because I think about this too. It's in selling the farm, it was really important to get farmers to buy it, because it's not that land, and the land that is being dried up or even partially fallowed is not growing food, it's not supporting wildlife, it's not, I mean, there are a lot of things that go with that. The loss of the farmer's livelihood is one thing, although the aging farmer might be able to sell and get a bunch of money. And so that person and his heirs are maybe a little bit better off. But what about the drying up of the land? And what does that mean for climate? Because that doesn't seem to be part of what the conversation. Because when we blame farmers, we're also saying, well, we're also, you know, if they're dried up, that's not good, not good. I don't believe it, because it's going to make the climate a hotter place. Desertification, I don't know how to say that word, but anyway, desertification. So go ahead.
Oh, Tershia, thanks for that. First things first, let me validate something you said, which is for the irrigated farmland in Colorado that has shifted its use, whether that's fallowed or whether there's a city now there where it was, those were all voluntary transactions. And it's been important to the state, both politically and in conversations and communities, to really preserve that private nature of the water rights, so that folks can make use of that as part of their wealth. And so that transfer is seldom challenged in that way and in that question. It's a great question to ask, and I think we need an atmospheric scientist to help us understand how changing irrigated agriculture changes the ecology of a place. And if it is of benefit in one area and less of a benefit in another. But I do know that Colorado residents really prefer bucolic landscapes and keeping irrigated agriculture in production. And they like to see those things when they're surveyed and when they come to public fora. And so the disconnect maybe is between understanding how growth affects our state and how growth affects those bucolic landscapes. And do we want to have those kinds of difficult conversations about what that might mean? Tershia, I have a contemporary question about water. This one has grabbed some headlines, especially in Colorado. This is from Alf Gardner. What do you think about Nebraska's plan to build a canal in Colorado to pull siphon water off, is what Alf says, siphon water off the South Platte River?
Thank God that Hal Simpson prepared me for this question. And thank Kevin Rain for backing him up. I think we can maybe answer that. My answer to that question can be served by an adverb. What do you think? Let's see. Let's try the word sustainably. Adverb, sustainably. So with the goal of keeping irrigated agriculture going, farmers are under regular assault and needing to get attorneys, which makes their operation a whole lot more expensive. So they sustainably fallow some fields, and they sustainably put in a center pivot. irrigation system. So they've, with the sustain, let's see how I do. Oh, Hal. Anyway, center pivots, I think, are more efficient. And so they're 75% efficient, which means they're using 25% more water than furrow irrigation. So because they're using more, there's less water going back into the river. So less water all the way down the Platte, with everybody that's just said to Denver Metro or to Highland Ranch or to whomever, to Mr. Lemke, yes, we'll lease you our water, and we'll put in the several. It's okay because we'll put in a center pivot so we can still make some money. So Nebraska, I think, as part of the Nebraska, is it the Nebraska Colorado South Platte Compact, right? As part
That's
of their compact, I think they're allowed to do that. The reason they're doing it is because there's not enough water with the way we're operating. Is that true?
You know, there's a bit of a framing
I don't know.
of that conversation, that in recognition of a changing climate, knowing Colorado as a headwater state and urbanizing fast, there's a concern by downstream folks that they may not get the historical water allocation that they've had before. That's a little bit of how the argument is framed. And within the South Platte Compact, there's an agreement to allow Nebraska to be able to build a canal and pull water off. Now, it's my understanding Colorado has never shorted Nebraska on its water allocation and has always made plans to deliver on that compact. And in other areas in the state have taken some measures to ensure that they make those delivery flows. So perhaps this is one part banking against a future where you're a little concerned about what happens in the headwater state. And maybe it's one part political in the sense that there are other political incentives to poking at your neighboring state that you might be able to further if you're someone who's in office today. So I think there's a little bit of both those things taking place. From a hydrological sense and from an ecological sense, I'd love to hear some folks maybe type in the chat about what they think about building that canal and what that might be like. Tershia, I've got another question for you.
Well, I need to also to apologize to all these people that are asking smart questions. Don't anyone ask about evaporation rates or adverb shell. Evaporation rates, no.
Tershia, you made a really good point though, and I think it's good for the folks that are with us to hear this too, that if you improve the efficiency of water being applied to a crop, the crop can produce more, right? But it'll consumptively use more water when it does that. And anytime you increase yields, you necessarily increase consumptive use without some kind of genetic improvement in the crop. And so I think it's useful. I think it's useful to understand that, and that being more efficient in your delivery of water may reduce the amount of water that goes back to the river as a result of that in certain areas. So that can happen too, and that can be challenged because other downstream users are interested in those return flows.
Well, also the other thing that we don't think about is that the center pivot itself needed to have it came from somewhere. There was some mining that went on, there was some plastic that went into it. It took water to build the object that's creating the efficiency. And it's like drip irrigation in our gardens or on a farm. All those little gigas came from somewhere that required water. And watching our farmer who's selling center pivots, but watching him put those siphon tubes in, using our bodies is a it's a thing. It's a good thing too. I mean, I'm not a farmer. It's easy for me to say, but I don't think we can't, I don't think we're going to be able to, well, maybe technology will save us somehow. I don't know how though, without hurting some other land.
I have been impressed with how recent technological innovations have helped us to understand the right amount of water that's needed for a crop at the right time, at the right place in the root zone, and to be able to connect that to information that we have for predicting the weather and what our most recent weather events have been. So in that sense, we're getting more precision around how we use our water resources. And so there are opportunities there, but there also needs to be some larger questions asked. So I think that's important. I've got Tershia, there was another question here I just thought I might pass on to you that I found interesting. One of those is from Peter St. Clair, who wanted to know what you think about moving farms to the city. So from rural farms to doing something that's more like hydroponic farming or stacked vertical farming. And we're starting to see some more instances of that in the Denver area and in other cities. Do you have a sense for what that means for water resources?
I could see us doing that, and I feel often that the things I'm eating might have been raised that way because they're all in a package and they're all clean. but I think that we're forgetting Earth systems when we concentrate on that. The idea of complex soils and the carbon that can be sequestered in complex soils and the nutrient value. Why are we all needing electrolytes and minerals badly in supplements? What's the matter with the soil? Why are we getting it in our vegetables? That kind of thing. So that's and also when all land is done for, just dry or covered with solar panels, what happens to the wildlife? Then what? There's a really wonderful book called Cows Save the Planet by Judy Schwartz. And it's really interesting talking about the soil carbon connection. It's very worthwhile.
Tershia, thanks for that. Thanks for that advice. And to Peter's question, I would add too, so there's important questions about nutrition and there's important questions about scale. And it would be interesting to dive into just what would have to be the scale of vertical farming to supply the food shed with the needs that it has, and at what cost would that take place? So those are good questions for us to ask. Speaking of good questions, Tershia, I'd like to ask you just one more question for us, and then we'll shift to Jayla, who will provide us with some great information. Hey, if you could give us one piece of advice for your audience based on where we are today and something that we think about based on what you've learned as you've gone forward, the assumptions that you've challenged. If you could just pick one piece of advice to give this group about how they should intersect in the water world and agriculture and rural and urban and Bill and Gogo, what would that piece of advice be?
I think it goes back to the idea of duality and getting along with each other. I mean, there's a lot of divisiveness, as we all know. And what happens is that each of us is confident in our position about whatever our position is, because it's reinforced socially in our cohorts that we talk to each other. And that might be, not necessarily is, but it might be obscuring the fact that our own nose is not that clean. And I think that for me, the biggest advice I wish is that each of us would accept that we don't know, for instance, everything there is to know about farming or anything. And that if we're blaming some other, whoever it is, if it's a president, if it's a farmer, whatever it is, to accept some blame ourselves And I'm going to say I am to blame. I, Tershia Delgin, am to blame. And then that guilt helps me be more careful.
Mm.
I hope. I mean, I'm to blame. So now we know. Now we know who's to blame. You
Tershia,
guys, thanks so much for putting up with me.
Tershia, I've enjoyed our conversations that we've had together, and I appreciate the wishes for accountability for all of us to be thoughtful and to be caring, and to, as you have done, have a personal connection to the choices that we make. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jayla Poppleton to talk to us a little bit about Water22.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you, Tershia, for just a fascinating conversation. Thank you for writing the book that you did, Tershia, and bringing us to the landscape and to the journey that your family has been on since before Colorado was a state. It was just absolutely fascinating for me and has really made me think about a lot of things and challenged some assumptions that I have had. And so I think that anyone here who's attended tonight, I hope that this gave you a little bit of a flavor of the book that Tershia wrote and the story that she has to tell in those pages and beyond. And I hope that you pick up The Man Who Thought He Owned Water and read it if you have not already. Thank you so much for your good work, Tershia, and also to you, Dr. Pritchett. I wanted to share along those lines of personal accountability that part of our message with the Water22 campaign is that it all starts here. It all starts here with our water resources being so fundamental to what makes Colorado a great place to live. And I think the next scariest thing to not having enough water is not having enough food to feed ourselves. So it's an incredibly important connection. But that message of it all starts here also goes to the idea that we each have a role to play. We can all do our part in how we interact with our water, and it starts right in our own homes and backyards and in our spheres of influence. So the Water22 campaign has 22 ways to care for Colorado water in 2022. It starts with knowing where your water comes from as the first step to understanding how your actions matter. And then we have various ways to conserve water indoors and outdoors, and also to protect the quality of that water to keep it clean so that it is useful to us and to our farmers and to the many creatures who depend on it in our natural environment. So please check out the 22 ways to care on the website at water22.org. We also encourage you to get involved at a deeper level in creating those systems changes and talking to elected officials and to being part of community planning processes around our water. Our next book I encourage you to check out as well is The River of Lost Souls by Jonathan Thompson. And this is really looking at the Gold King mine disaster from a number of years ago down in southwestern Colorado. And so more of a water quality focused discussion. So encourage you to check that out and read along with us and come participate in the next author talk. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Please get involved and be engaged in our water. It all starts here. So thank you again, Tershia, and also to Shea and Tattered Cover and to Dr. Pritchett. It was a wonderful event. All right, good night.